Elena Morales had always loved the sound of the piano, the way it could speak without words, the way it could tell stories her mouth could never say. She had grown up in a tiny town where people didn't dream big, where a piano was more decoration than instrument. Her mother had taught her how to play on an old upright piano that had one broken key. Every night after school, Elena would sit there, her small fingers trying to bring out a melody that could make her mother smile. Now, years later, she stood outside the grand concert hall of the city's most famous music conservatory, clutching her audition papers tightly. Her heart was beating so fast that she could feel it in her throat. The doors were tall and shiny, and through the glass she could see people in fine clothes, talking in low voices, laughing, and tuning instruments. She swallowed hard, feeling small in her plain dress and scuffed shoes. When she walked in, the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume hit her. The stage lights were bright, almost blinding. The judges sat in a neat row, clipboards in hand, watching the long line of hopeful musicians waiting for their turn. Among them sat Victor Hale, a famous pianist whose performances were as powerful as his pride. He had a reputation for being cruel during auditions. His words could break a person faster than silence could. Elena had read about him in music magazines. They called him a genius, but also a man with no patience for mediocrity. As she took a seat in the waiting area, she could see him through the open door. His posture was perfect, his expression cold. He scribbled notes on his paper after each performance, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes rolling his eyes. One by one, the contestants walked in, played their hearts out, and walked out with tears or tight smiles. Elena kept whispering to herself, "It's okay. Just play like you always do." But her hands were already trembling. Her number was called, and she stood up slowly. It felt like her legs didn't want to move, but she forced herself forward. When she reached the stage, the world suddenly felt too big. The grand piano looked like a mountain she had to climb. The judges didn't smile, they didn't greet her, they just waited. The silence was heavy. Elena bowed politely and said softly, "Good afternoon," but no one replied. Victor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes studied her from head to toe. Then he whispered to the judge next to him, loud enough for Elena to hear, "She barely looks like she knows where middle C is." The other judge gave a small laugh. Elena's ears burned, her heart squeezed. She wanted to disappear right then. For a moment she thought about leaving, walking off the stage and never coming back. But then she remembered her mother's voice. "Music doesn't come from fingers, my love. It comes from truth." Her mother used to say that every time Elena got nervous, it was her reminder that music was not about impressing people. It was about speaking honestly. Elena sat down on the piano bench, adjusted the seat quietly, and placed her fingers on the keys. She could feel Victor's gaze like a weight on her shoulders. She took a deep breath. Her mind was full of noise, fear, doubt, anger. But she tried to find one small space inside her that was calm. She closed her eyes for a second and imagined her mother sitting beside her, smiling softly like she used to. Victor sighed impatiently, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Any time today." Elena didn't respond. She wasn't going to let his words decide her moment. She pressed one key, just one. The sound that came out was clean. Deep and warm, it echoed softly through the hall, filling the air with something delicate and pure. Victor stopped tapping his pen. His eyebrows twitched slightly. The other judges looked up from their papers, surprised by how powerful that single note had sounded. Elena let the sound fade completely before she continued. That first note was like a heartbeat, steady and full of life. Her fingers began to move, slowly at first. Each note blended with the next, forming a gentle melody that carried emotion instead of perfection. It was simple, but it was alive. It wasn't a performance, it was a confession. As she played, the world outside that hall seemed to disappear. The sound of her music wrapped around the room like a soft blanket. Everyone listened, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't help it. Even Victor, the man who had mocked her, leaned forward slightly, his eyes no longer cold but searching. When the last note faded into silence, Elena kept her hands on the keys, afraid to move. The room was still, completely still. For a second, no one spoke. Then Victor slowly put down his pen. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something almost like respect. Elena finally looked up, breathing hard. She had done it, not to prove him wrong, but to prove to herself that her truth mattered. As she stood and bowed, Victor's voice broke the silence. Softer this time. What's your name? He asked. She smiled gently. Elena Morales. She walked off the stage with shaking hands, but her heart felt lighter than it ever had. The hall behind her was still quiet, still caught in the echo of her music. No one laughed now, not even Victor, because sometimes it only takes one note to change everything. Elena walked out of the audition room with her heart still racing. Her hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something deeper, relief mixed with disbelief. She had done it. She had faced the judges. She had faced him, Victor Hale, the man everyone feared. And she had played her truth. Still, a small voice inside her whispered, was it enough? Outside the hall, the air was cold and sharp. Her breath came out in small white clouds as she stepped into the courtyard. A few other contestants sat on the benches, clutching their sheet music, whispering nervously. Some looked at her as she passed, trying to read her face. But Elena kept walking, her mind spinning. She found an empty spot near the fountain and sat down. The sound of running water reminded her of the rhythm of the piano keys. Constant and calm. She took a deep breath, but her body refused to relax. Her mind replayed the scene again and again. Victor's smirk, the whisper, the single note. The silence. Then doubt began to creep in. Maybe they were just shocked, not impressed, she thought. Maybe they'll forget me the moment the next person walks in. She remembered how Victor had looked at her. That mix of surprise and confusion, was that respect? Or was he just puzzled by my courage? She pressed her palms together, trying to stop them from trembling. Why do I care what he thinks? She asked herself. He's just a man with a fancy title, but the truth was, she cared because his words had cut deep. She had spent her whole life fighting against doubt. And in a few seconds, his laughter had brought all those old wounds back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her younger brother. How did it go, Lena? Mom would be proud. The words hit her like a warm hug. For a moment she smiled, then tears gathered in her eyes. She wiped them quickly before anyone could see. She didn't want to cry now, not when she had finally stood her ground. The heavy wooden doors behind her opened. A few people walked out talking about their performances. One of the girls whispered, "Did you hear that one note? That girl from the countryside?" Even the great Victor Hale stopped breathing. Elena froze. She wasn't sure if they were exaggerating, but the thought made her chest tighten. Meanwhile, inside the audition room, Victor still sat quietly, staring at his notes. The other judges had already started discussing the next performance, but he hadn't written a single word after Elena played. His pen rested on the paper, untouched. He didn't understand what he had just heard. It wasn't perfect technique, it wasn't grand or complex, but there was something haunting about that sound. It had felt human, painfully human. One of the judges leaned toward him and whispered, "She was different, wasn't she?" Victor didn't answer right away. He finally muttered, "That girl played like she wasn't trying to impress anyone." The other judge smiled slightly. Maybe that's why it worked. Back outside, Elena waited as the evening sun began to set, turning the sky into soft shades of gold and pink. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. She opened her small lunchbox, a sandwich and a half-crushed apple. She smiled at how ordinary it looked in such an extraordinary day. A little boy passing by stopped to listen to the faint music still echoing from the hall. He looked at her and said, "Are you the one who played inside?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. The boy grinned. "My mom said it made her cry." Then he ran off before she could reply. Elena laughed softly, shaking her head. The next morning, she woke up early in her small rented room. The letter from the conservatory would take days to arrive, but her mind wouldn't rest. She kept thinking about what she could have done better. Should she have played something more technical? Should she have smiled more? The world of music wasn't just about emotion. It was about precision, about rules, about impressing the right people. But then she sat at the piano in the corner of the room, the one she practiced on at night when the city was asleep. She closed her eyes and played the same note again, the same one that had silenced the hall. The sound filled her little apartment, soft but full. It reminded her why she started in the first place, not for trophies, not for approval, but because music was the only language that never lied. That evening, she got a call from the conservatory office. A polite woman's voice said, "Miss Morales, the judges were very moved by your audition. We'd like you to return tomorrow for a second evaluation. Elena froze, her heart jumping. A second evaluation? She repeated. Yes, the woman said. One of the judges personally requested it. When the call ended, Elena sat still for a long time. She didn't need to ask who the judge was. She already knew. Victor Hale. The man who laughed at her wanted to see her again. That night she couldn't sleep. Her emotions twisted between joy and fear. What if he wants to prove I was lucky? What if he sets a trap to humiliate me? But another part of her whispered, what if he truly heard me? As dawn crept through her window, painting the room in pale light, Elena made a promise to herself. No matter what happens tomorrow, I will not let fear decide my music. She placed her fingers gently on the keys once more, letting them glide over the piano like water. The sound that came out was soft, strong, and sure. The next day, when she walked back into that same hall, she was no longer the same girl who trembled under Victor's stare. She had doubt in her heart, yes, but now she also had courage. Because she had learned something powerful that night. Doubt is not the end of a dream. It's the silence before the next note. Elena stood backstage once again, her palms slightly sweaty, the faint scent of polished wood and old velvet filling the air. It had been only a day since her first audition, yet it felt like weeks the world had shifted in small, quiet ways. Her nerves were still there, fluttering like tiny wings inside her chest, but underneath them was something new, strength, quiet and stubborn. The hall looked just as grand as before, but this time it felt different. Yesterday it had been a battlefield. Today it felt like a conversation waiting to happen. She could hear the faint sound of tuning from inside, each note bouncing off the tall marble walls. The echoes reminded her of her mother's voice, always patient, always gentle. When the stage manager called her name, Elena took a deep breath and stepped forward. The door creaked slightly as she entered. The same judges sat at the long table, pens ready, papers neatly stacked. But the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't cold anymore, it was expectant. Curious, Victor Hale sat in the center again, his posture sharp as ever, but his eyes weren't mocking this time. They were searching, measuring. He gave a single nod when she walked in. It wasn't a smile, but for Victor, it was close enough, Miss Morales, he said, his voice calm but focused. Yesterday you played something. Unusual, he paused, glancing at his notes. You caught everyone's attention with one note. I'd like to hear what you can do beyond that, Elena nodded quietly. She didn't say much. Words felt too small for what she carried inside. She sat down on the piano bench again. The smooth surface was cool under her fingertips. The keys gleamed like white teeth under the light. She adjusted her seat, exhaled, and waited for silence. The room fell still. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade away. It was that sacred moment, the one right before the first sound. To most it was just a pause, but to Elena it was everything. It was the space where fear and faith touched, where the heart prepared to speak. She lifted her hands above the keys and didn't move. Everyone was watching, waiting for her to begin. But she didn't rush, she closed her eyes, and for a few seconds there was nothing but her breathing and the steady thump of her heart. Victor's pen hovered over his clipboard. His jaw tightened slightly. What is she waiting for? He thought. But then he saw something shift in her posture. Her shoulders relaxed, her fingers curved gently, and suddenly the air in the room seemed to change. Then, she played. The first note slid out like a whisper, fragile yet clear. It hung in the air, trembling slightly before fading into silence. The next one followed, then another slowly. She began to weave a melody, soft at first, like the beginning of a story. Each note carried emotion so real that even the judges forgot to write. She wasn't playing a famous piece or a technical showpiece, it was something entirely her own. The melody moved like a heartbeat, hesitant, then confident, then breaking into something raw and beautiful. It wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. In that moment, the silence between her notes became just as powerful as the music itself. The pauses spoke of loss, of love, of quiet evenings by her mother's side. The audience, though small, could feel it. They weren't listening to a performance. They were listening to a confession. Victor leaned forward, his usual cool expression cracking slightly. He recognized something he hadn't heard in years. Honesty, real and unpolished. It was the kind of honesty that couldn't be taught in music schools. The kind that life carved into a person through pain and persistence. Elena's fingers danced lightly, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She forgot about the judges, forgot about Victor, forgot about everything but the story she was telling. She played like she was writing a letter to her mother, a letter made of sound instead of words. Then, right in the middle of the piece, she stopped. Her fingers hovered in midair. The silence that followed was deep and electric. Every person in the hall leaned forward unconsciously, as if drawn by an invisible string. Victor's breath caught in his throat. Why did she stop? He wondered. But then he realized. She hadn't stopped because she forgot. She stopped because she meant to. It was part of the message. That silence carried as much weight as her music. It was the silence of grief, of waiting, of hope, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any sound ever could. And then gently she continued. The melody changed, brighter now, lighter, as if the sun had risen somewhere behind the pain. Her hands moved with confidence, and for a moment, it felt like she was playing not just for them, but for everyone who had ever doubted themselves. By the time she struck the final note, no one in the hall moved. The sound lingered like a fading heartbeat before dissolving into stillness. Elena sat there, her chest rising and falling, her eyes still closed. The silence that followed was the kind that couldn't be broken easily. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but of awe. Victor put his pen down slowly, deliberately. The other judges exchanged glances but said nothing. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. What was that piece? Elena opened her eyes and looked at him. It doesn't have a name, she said quietly. It's just something I play when I miss my mother. No one responded for a long moment. Victor looked down, his expression unreadable. Then almost imperceptibly he nodded, not as a judge, but as a fellow musician who had just been reminded of what music truly meant. When Elena stood and walked off the stage, the echo of her melody seemed to follow her. Wrapping around the room, her footsteps were soft, but they carried more power than applause ever could. Behind her, Victor sat back in his chair, staring at the piano. He realized that in all his years of chasing perfection, he had forgotten how it felt to simply feel a note. And in that silent hall, long after Elena had gone, he whispered to himself, maybe one note is all it takes to remember who you are. The final note of Elena's melody still floated in the air long after she left the stage. It was as if the piano itself refused to let it go, refusing to allow the moment to end. Inside the great hall, time felt slower, softer, like the world was listening for something it didn't quite understand. Victor Hale sat frozen in his chair, his hand still resting on his pen. He didn't move, he didn't blink. He simply listened to the silence that her music had left behind. For years, Victor had believed he'd heard everything music could offer. He'd heard perfect performances, technical masterpieces, fast fingers, flawless rhythm, but nothing had ever made him feel the way that one note did. It wasn't just sound. It was emotion given shape, pain given a voice. It was like the truth had slipped through the cracks of time and whispered directly into his soul. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The other judges finally began writing on their papers, exchanging quiet looks that said more than words ever could. One of them whispered, "Did you feel that?" And the other simply nodded. Victor didn't write anything. Instead, he closed his notebook and stared at the piano like it had become something alive. Meanwhile, Elena stood in the corridor, her back pressed against the cold wall. Her heartbeat hadn't slowed yet. She could still feel the echo of that final note vibrating through her chest. She didn't know if it had been good enough, or if the judges had understood what she was trying to say, but deep down she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she hadn't played to be accepted. She had played to be heard. A young staff member walked by and gave her a small smile. "You played beautifully," he whispered. Elena's lips curved slightly, but her voice was quiet. "Thank you," she said. "I just played what I felt." As she walked out into the crisp evening air, the world felt strangely still. The city lights flickered like scattered stars, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint hum of a street musician playing an old tune. She paused for a moment, listening, smiling at the reminder that music lived everywhere, not just in grand halls. Back inside, Victor remained alone after the session ended. The other judges had left, their footsteps fading into the marble corridors. But he stayed, sitting in the same spot, staring at the piano. The hall was empty now, shadows stretching long across the floor. He stood slowly and walked toward the instrument, his shoes echoing in the quiet. When he reached it, he placed one hand gently on the polished wood. It was cool to the touch. He pressed a single key, the same note Elena had played first. The sound filled the hall again, soft but haunting. And for a second he understood. He finally understood that she hadn't just played notes, she had played memory. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he remembered the day his own mother had taken him to his first recital. He remembered her proud smile, her applause, and the promise he had made, to play with heart, not ego. Somewhere along the line, he had forgotten that promise, lost it in competitions and fame. Now, one young woman's music had brought it all rushing back. The next morning, Elena was sitting by the small window in her apartment, sunlight spilling across her notebook. She was writing down bits of melodies, little fragments that came to her like whispers. Each one reminded her of something: her mother's laughter, the smell of rain, the echo of that hall. Her phone buzzed suddenly. She looked down and froze. It was an email from the conservatory. The subject line read, "Congratulations, Miss Morales." Her heart skipped. She opened it quickly, scanning the words with trembling eyes. She had been accepted, not just accepted, but awarded a scholarship. At the bottom, there was a handwritten note scanned in from one of the judges. The handwriting was elegant and firm. It read, "Your music reminded us why we fell in love with sound. Never stop playing your truth. V.H." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth, laughing softly between her tears. It wasn't just the acceptance that moved her, it was the acknowledgement. The man who had once laughed at her now believed in her. She spent that afternoon walking through the city with a strange lightness in her step. The sounds of people, cars, and birds blended into a quiet symphony around her. Every sound, even the ordinary ones, felt like part of the same music she carried inside. A few days later, the conservatory hosted a small recital for new students. Elena was asked to perform first. The hall was full again, though smaller than before. As she stepped onto the stage, she spotted Victor sitting near the front, not as a judge this time, but as a listener. Their eyes met for a second, and she gave a small nod. Victor returned it just once and then looked toward the piano. Elena sat down, her fingers brushing the keys. She could feel the same energy she had felt before, the calm, the silence, the waiting. She smiled faintly and began to play. Her piece was new, built around that same powerful note, the one that had frozen the hall days earlier. But now it carried something more: peace, forgiveness, light. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft and delicate, sometimes strong and full. The audience leaned in, caught in her rhythm. When she reached the end, she played that one note again, holding it longer than before, letting it bloom into the stillness. And once again, the hall froze. People forgot to breathe. Victor closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. It was as if time itself had bowed its head to listen. When the note finally faded, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of life, full of connection. Elena looked up at the audience and saw tears, smiles, and wonder. She knew then that her music had done what it was meant to do. It had reached hearts. Victor stood and clapped first, slowly, deliberately. The rest of the room followed, applause growing like thunder, but Elena didn't hear the clapping as noise. She heard it as rhythm, as gratitude, as proof that one honest note could change everything. That day, her name began to spread, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. And somewhere deep inside, she promised herself that no matter how far she went, she would always remember that single, trembling note that started it all, because that one note had not just silenced a hall, it had awakened it. The night after her recital, Elena couldn't sleep. The sound of that final note still echoed in her mind, soft and endless. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart full of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pride exactly. It was deeper, gentler, like she had finally opened a locked door inside her soul. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the audience's faces frozen in silence, and Victor Hale standing among them, clapping with tears quietly shining in his eyes. Morning came softly, sunlight spilling through her window. The city outside buzzed with life. Buses, laughter, footsteps. But Elena moved slowly, still wrapped in the dream of last night. Her phone was full of messages from other students, from old friends, even from people she didn't know. "You were amazing." That note, it gave me goosebumps. "How did you do that?" She smiled at the screen but didn't reply right away. She didn't want to lose the quiet. She sat down at her piano, touched the keys, and just let her fingers wander. No sheet music, no plan, just her heart leading her. The melody that came out was warm and full of sunlight. It felt new, like a beginning. A few hours later, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the conservatory office. "Miss Morales," said the voice. "The dean would like to meet you this afternoon." Elena's heart jumped. She had only just arrived at this place and already the dean wanted to see her. When she entered his office, the air smelled faintly of old books and coffee. The dean was an older man with kind eyes. He smiled as she came in. "Elena Morales," he said, "you've caused quite a stir." She froze for a moment, unsure if that was good or bad. He chuckled softly. "Relax, my dear. It's a good stir." He leaned back in his chair. "Victor Hale hasn't stopped talking about your performance." "That's a first." Elena blinked, surprised. "Mr. Hale talked about me?" The dean nodded. "He said you reminded him what music used to mean." He paused, his tone softer. "You know, I've seen hundreds of students pass through this school, all chasing perfection, but very few chase honesty. You, Elena, play with honesty." Elena felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say thank you, but her voice didn't come out. The dean smiled knowingly. "We'd like to offer you a mentorship. Mr. Hale himself has volunteered to train you personally if you're willing." Her mind went blank. Victor Hale, the same man who once mocked her, now wanted to be her mentor. For a moment she couldn't speak. She simply nodded. "Yes, I'd be honored." The following week, her lessons with Victor began. At first, they were awkward. Victor wasn't a man of many gentle words. His criticism was sharp, precise, but different now. Never cruel, always constructive. "You rush through emotion," he would say. "Let the note breathe," or "Don't control the sound, listen to it." Elena would nod, try again, and each time she played, something in her grew stronger, clearer. She started to understand what Victor meant when he talked about the space between notes. It was the silence that gave meaning to the sound. Some days she grew frustrated. Her fingers stumbled, her timing faltered. Victor would sigh, then simply say, "Stop playing for me, play for yourself." And when she did, the music came alive again. Weeks turned into months, and Elena's reputation began to spread far beyond the conservatory. Her performances were small but unforgettable. People said her piano spoke, that it made them remember things they had long forgotten. Childhood, love, loss, hope. Her name started appearing in music blogs, then in newspapers. "The girl with the one note," they called her. Despite the growing attention, Elena stayed grounded. She still practiced in her tiny apartment late at night, still took walks through the park to clear her mind, but she noticed a change inside her. Music no longer scared her, it empowered her. Every piece she played carried a story, and each story became a piece of her own transformation. One afternoon after class, Victor asked her to stay behind. He sat quietly, watching her pack up her sheet music. "Do you know why your music works, Elena?" he asked. She looked at him curiously. "Because I practice hard?" He smiled faintly. "No, because you don't hide." His words lingered in her mind long after she left. She realized he was right. For years she had hidden her pain, her doubts, her loneliness, but through her piano, she had stopped hiding. She had turned her wounds into songs, and that honesty was what people felt when she played. A few weeks later, Victor invited her to accompany him at a charity concert in the city. "It's not a competition," he said. "It's a conversation between two musicians." Elena was nervous but excited. On the night of the concert, the stage lights felt less frightening this time. Victor stood beside her before they began. "Just remember," he whispered, "don't play for applause, play for truth." When they began, the music between them flowed like a river. Sometimes Victor led, sometimes Elena did. Their melodies intertwined like threads of light and shadow. The audience sat completely still, lost in the story they were weaving. When the concert ended, the applause was thunderous. But what stayed in Elena's heart was not the sound of clapping. It was the look on Victor's face. Pride, peace, and something like gratitude. Afterward, as they stood backstage, Victor turned to her and said softly, "You've changed me, you know." Elena blinked, surprised. "Me?" He nodded. "You reminded me that music isn't about control. It's about surrender." That night, walking home under the glow of city lights, Elena smiled to herself. She realized that transformation wasn't a sudden event. It was quiet, gradual, like a song that unfolds note by note. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning. She wasn't just learning to play piano anymore. She was learning to live through it, because music, she now understood, wasn't what came from her hands, it was what came from her heart. And that was the truest transformation of all. The night of the charity concert marked a turning point in Elena's life. Yet she didn't fully understand it until days later. When the applause had faded and the excitement settled into silence, the music she had played with Victor still lingered in her chest like a soft echo. But something inside her felt different, lighter, as if she had stepped through an invisible door she hadn't even known existed. That morning, sunlight spilled across her piano. Dust dancing in the air like tiny sparks, she sat on the bench, her fingers brushing over the cool ivory keys. She didn't play right away. Instead, she closed her eyes and just listened. Not to music, but to the quiet for the first time. She wasn't chasing perfection or fearing mistakes. She was simply being. Her phone buzzed, a message from Victor. "Meet me at the rehearsal hall 2 p.m. Don't bring sheet music." She smiled slightly. That sounded exactly like him. She didn't ask why. She just packed her things and went. When she arrived, the rehearsal room was empty except for Victor. Sitting on a chair near the piano, he looked calmer than usual. Less like a strict mentor and more like an old friend deep in thought. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the piano. She obeyed. "Still unsure what to expect? I want to show you something," he said quietly. "Something I haven't told anyone before." He stood, walked to the piano, and placed his hand on the same key she had played in her first audition, the one note that had silenced the hall. "When I was young," Victor began, his voice low and steady, "I used to believe music was a battlefield. Every performance was a war to win, every mistake a wound, and every applause a victory." He paused, his eyes distant. "But over time I started losing the joy. The more I tried to control music, the less it spoke to me. Until one day, I stopped hearing it at all." He looked at her now, his gaze heavy with truth. "And then you came with one note, and reminded me what I had forgotten." Elena didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened. "I didn't mean to," she began. But Victor interrupted softly. "That's the point. You didn't mean to, you just were, and that's what made it real." He stepped back and gestured to the piano. "Play something, anything, but don't think, don't plan. Just let it happen." Elena hesitated, then took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She let her mind go blank and her heart lead. The first note came out soft, almost shy, then another. Then another. Slowly a melody formed. Fragile and pure. It wasn't a song she knew, but it felt like it had been waiting inside her all along. Victor closed his eyes, listening. His head nodded slightly with the rhythm. The music filled the empty room like sunlight spilling through a crack. Elena could feel something rising in her chest. A warmth. A release. It was as if all the fear, grief, and love she had ever carried were flowing out through her fingertips. When she finished, the last note lingered like a whisper. The silence that followed felt alive. Victor opened his eyes slowly. His voice was quiet but sure. "That," he said, "is the sound of awakening." Elena looked at him, puzzled. "Awakening?" He smiled faintly. Yes, you've stopped playing music and started becoming it. His words stayed with her long after she left. That evening, she walked through the city with her headphones on but no music playing. She listened to the rhythm of footsteps, the hum of cars, the laughter from a nearby cafe. Everything sounded like part of a grand symphony she had never noticed before. She began to realize that music was everywhere, in the soft breeze against her cheek, in the heartbeat she felt when she was nervous, in the quiet moments of solitude. It wasn't something that belonged only to the piano. It was something that lived inside her. That night she sat by her window, watching rain fall. The drops tapped gently against the glass, and she smiled, hearing a rhythm in them. Without thinking, she opened her notebook and began to write, not with rules or notes but with feelings. The melody she wrote that night became her first true composition. Simple yet alive, days turned into weeks, and Elena's life began to change in quiet but powerful ways. She no longer practiced out of fear of failure. She practiced out of love. Her performances grew warmer, deeper. More people began to attend, drawn not by her fame but by the peace they felt when she played. One evening, after a recital, a little girl approached her shyly. Holding a small notebook, "Miss Elena," she said softly, "your music makes me feel brave." Elena knelt down and smiled. "Then promise me something," she said gently. "Whenever you feel scared, listen to the silence. There's music there, too." The girl nodded, her eyes shining, and hugged her tightly. Elena watched her go, her heart full. Later that night, Victor called. His voice was softer than usual. "You did well today," he said. "You've found something most musicians spend a lifetime searching for." "What's that?" Elena asked. "Stillness," he replied. "The place where music begins after they hung up." Elena sat at her piano once more. She played that same single note from her audition, and as it filled her small apartment, she realized something beautiful. The world hadn't changed, she had. She no longer needed applause or approval. The silence that followed her music no longer frightened her. It felt like home. That was her moment of awakening. The quiet understanding that music wasn't about reaching the world's ears. It was about touching its heart. And from that night onward, every time she played, the hall didn't just listen, it felt, because Elena Morales was no longer the girl who wanted to be heard. She had become the sound itself. The seasons changed, and so did Elena. The girl who once trembled before a piano now carried herself with calm confidence. Her music had begun to reach places she never imagined. Concert halls, radio programs, even online videos where strangers around the world wrote, "Her notes feel like home." But despite the growing fame, she stayed humble, still living in her small apartment, still practicing in the quiet mornings when the world was half asleep. One crisp autumn afternoon, she received a letter that would change everything. It came sealed in gold, with the emblem of the Vienna International Music Festival, the most prestigious stage for classical musicians in the world. Elena's hands shook as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the words. "You have been invited to perform as a featured artist." Her breath caught. This was every pianist's dream, the place where legends were made. She called Victor immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Victor," she said breathlessly, "they invited me to Vienna." There was a pause, then a small smile in his voice. "I knew they would," he said simply. "You're ready." The weeks that followed were a blur of rehearsals, meetings and travel preparations. Reporters called. Photographers asked for interviews. Her schedule filled faster than she could process it. But through it all, she never forgot the simple truth Victor had taught her. Play with honesty, not pride. Before she left for Austria, Victor visited her one last time. He looked older somehow, his eyes softer but heavier. "Elena," he said quietly, "this will be your biggest stage yet. But remember, greatness doesn't come from the grandness of the hall. It comes from the quietness of the soul." She smiled. "I'll remember." On the morning of the performance, Vienna glowed under the golden light of early winter. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the cobblestone streets as Elena walked toward the concert hall. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. This time, it was anticipation. The hall was enormous, chandeliers glittering like stars above hundreds of expectant faces. The air buzzed with energy, whispers of curiosity filling the room. "That's the girl who made Victor Hale cry," someone murmured. Elena heard it and almost laughed, remembering how impossible that had once sounded. Backstage, she stood in front of the mirror. Smoothing her black dress, her reflection looked calm, but inside, waves of emotion rose and fell. She thought of her mother, of the broken piano they'd shared, of the nights she'd played to an audience of one. She whispered softly, "This is for you, Mama," and stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded her for a moment. The hall stretched before her like an ocean of faces. But then she saw the piano waiting, gleaming under the spotlight, and suddenly everything else faded. She walked to it slowly, gracefully, the sound of her heels echoing against the wooden floor. When she sat down, the audience hushed. It was the same sacred silence she had felt years ago during her first audition. The silence before sound, the silence where truth lived. She placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began. The music that flowed from her hands was unlike anything she had ever played before. It wasn't rehearsed or planned. It was raw, alive, and full of memory. It carried the laughter of her childhood, the pain of her mother's illness, the warmth of her brother's encouragement, and the wisdom Victor had given her. Every note shimmered with emotion. Halfway through, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered. A soft hum of static filled the air, and one of the stage lights went out. A murmur ran through the audience. The conductor looked alarmed. But Elena kept playing, unfazed. She didn't even look up. Instead, she leaned into the keys, her touch more deliberate now. The sudden darkness only made her music shine brighter. The audience could no longer see her face clearly, but they could feel her presence in every vibration of the piano. When the final note came, she didn't end it abruptly. She held it, letting it stretch, letting it breathe. It was the same note that had silenced Victor's laughter years ago, but now it was fuller, wiser. It was no longer a note of defiance, it was one of peace. The hall went completely still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. For a few endless seconds there was no sound. Then slowly, someone stood up and began to clap. Another followed and another, until the room erupted into applause so loud it shook her bones. Elena bowed deeply, her eyes glistening. But it wasn't pride that filled her. It was gratitude. Gratitude for every struggle, every doubt, every silence that had led her here. After the concert, reporters swarmed her backstage. But she only wanted to find Victor. When she finally spotted him near the exit, standing quietly with his coat draped over one arm, she rushed to him. "You came," she said breathlessly. He smiled faintly. "Did you think I'd miss it?" She laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes. "How was it?" She asked. Victor looked at her, his voice steady. "It wasn't a performance," he said. "It was a prayer." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victor reached into his pocket and handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "I was going to wait until after Vienna," he said. "But maybe now's the right time." She unfolded it. It was a letter of recommendation, written in his familiar handwriting. For Elena Morales, it read, "A pianist who doesn't just play notes but reveals souls. May she remind the world that music is not heard, it is felt." Her tears fell freely now. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you for believing in me." "Even when I didn't believe in myself," Victor smiled. "No, Elena, you taught me to believe again, that night." As she stood outside the grand hall under a sky full of snowflakes, Elena looked up and closed her eyes, letting the cold air kiss her skin somewhere far away. She could almost hear her mother's laughter carried by the wind, and in that moment, she realized something she had never fully understood. Every hardship, every doubt, every silence had been preparing her for this. The turning point of her life wasn't the applause or the fame. It was the quiet realization that she had found her purpose. Not to play louder, not to play faster, but to play truthfully. And as she walked away from the hall that night, her footprints soft in the snow, she smiled, because she finally understood. Her journey wasn't about becoming great. It was about becoming real. Years passed, yet people still spoke about that night in Vienna. The night a young woman played a single note that made the world hold its breath. Elena Morales' name had become more than a name. It had become a feeling, a memory, a sound that lingered long after her performances ended. But Elena never let the fame change her. She still lived simply, still practiced alone in quiet rooms, still carried her mother's picture in her piano case everywhere she went. Audiences would beg her to play that note, the one that froze the hall in awe, the one that had become her signature. At first she resisted, afraid that people were chasing the legend, not the meaning behind it, but eventually she understood that they weren't asking for the note itself. They were asking to feel something real, something true. Elena began to travel across the world, performing in grand concert halls and tiny community theaters alike. Whether she played for 1,000 people or 10, she gave the same honesty, the same emotion. She played for the hearts in the room, not the applause. During one of her tours in Japan, she met a little boy named Ren. He was blind but loved music more than anything. After her concert, he approached her backstage, holding a small wooden recorder. "I can't see you," he said softly, "but I can hear your heart when you play." Elena knelt in front of him, touched by his words. "Then you already understand music better than most people," she said. Ren smiled. "Can you teach me to play the way you do?" She paused, her heart swelling. "No one can teach you to play like me," she said gently, "but I can help you find your note." That day changed something inside her. For years she had been sharing her music, but now she wanted to share her gift. She decided to open a small music academy, the One Note Foundation, a place where young musicians from around the world could learn, not just technique but truth. Victor Hale helped her set it up. Though his hair had turned silver and his hands trembled slightly, he laughed the day they hung the sign over the entrance. "Do you realize, Elena," he said, "that you've become everything you once feared and everything you once dreamed at the same time?" She smiled. "I just followed the sound at the academy." She refused to grade students by speed or precision. Instead, she listened, really listened. Each student had to play one simple note for their first lesson. Some played it loud, others soft, some with fear, some with joy. And each time Elena would close her eyes and ask, "What are you trying to say with that sound?" Word spread quickly. Students began arriving from different countries. Some couldn't afford to pay, but she never turned anyone away. "Music belongs to everyone," she'd say, "especially those who believe they have nothing to offer." One rainy afternoon, Victor visited her classroom, watching quietly as her students practiced. His eyes shone with quiet pride. "You've done something remarkable," he said later, sitting beside her. "You've turned your note into a movement." Elena smiled. "You once said music was a battlefield," she reminded him. "Now it feels more like a garden." Victor chuckled softly. "And look at all that's grown." A few months later, Victor fell ill. His health had been fragile for a while, but he never complained. He kept visiting the academy as often as he could, giving advice, listening to performances, always patient, always present. One evening, Elena sat by his hospital bed, the sound of soft rain against the window filling the silence. "Do you remember the first time you heard me play?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly, his voice raspy. "How could I forget? You silenced my arrogance with a single sound." She laughed softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "You taught me to believe in silence." He reached out a trembling hand and placed it over hers. "Promise me something," he whispered. "When I'm gone, keep playing that note, not for me, not for anyone else, for yourself." She nodded, unable to speak. After Victor passed away, the world mourned him, but Elena honored him the only way she knew how. She played. She organized a tribute concert in his memory, not in a grand hall, but in the garden outside her academy, surrounded by her students and the people whose lives he had touched. When she sat at the piano that evening, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The audience sat quietly, waiting. Elena closed her eyes and pressed the key, that note, the same one that had once silenced a room of judges, the same one that had changed her life. The sound rose softly into the air, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself bowed in reverence. The trees swayed gently, the air held its breath somewhere. She imagined Victor smiling, and her mother too. Proud and at peace, the note faded, but its echo lived in every heart that heard it. Years later, people still spoke of her. They told stories of the girl who turned pain into melody, who taught the world that a single sound could hold infinite meaning. Her academy grew into a sanctuary for dreamers, and her students carried her philosophy to every corner of the earth. And though Elena grew older, her fingers slower, her spirit never dimmed. Every morning she would still sit at her piano, press that one note and listen, not just to the sound, but to what came after, the silence that made it whole. One night, long after her final concert, when the moon hung full and bright above her window, Elena played that note one last time. The sound drifted into the night like a whisper of gratitude, soft and eternal. The next morning, her students found her at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys, her face peaceful. And when they pressed the same key she had loved all her life, the note rang out, clear, honest, endless. It was as if her soul had become part of the sound itself, forever alive in that single vibration, reminding the world that music, like truth, never dies, because in the end, it wasn't just a note that froze a hall in awe. It was the echo of a life played with courage, honesty, and heart, the legacy of a single note, living forever in the silence it left behind.